This bread tastes slightly sweet, and most people don't think about it. There's no frosting, no candy, no dessert, yet the sweetness doesn't come from where most people think. When people hear the words artificial sweeteners, they usually think about diet soda, or candy, or chewing gum. Bread is almost never part of that conversation. And yet, millions of people eat this kind of bread every single day. Kids, adults, families. Because bread feels simple, basic, safe. Food companies don't add sweetness only for taste. Sweetness affects texture, color, and how long food stays fresh. That's one of the reasons artificial sweeteners quietly became part of everyday food. But artificial sweeteners didn't begin in modern factories. They didn't start in fast food. They started more than a century ago, with a scientific accident. A chemist was working with industrial compounds. He forgot to wash his hands. And later, while eating, he noticed something strange. The food tasted unexpectedly sweet. That substance was called saccharin. At the time, sugar was expensive, sometimes unavailable, especially during war. Artificial sweeteners offered a new option for doctors, for governments, and for people with diabetes. That single discovery opened a long conversation about health, about science, and about how we sweeten our food. This is the story of artificial sweeteners, how they started, and how they became part of everyday life. After the discovery of saccharin, scientists quickly realized something important. This new substance was hundreds of times sweeter than sugar. That meant only a tiny amount was needed. For doctors treating diabetes, this was a breakthrough. For food manufacturers, it was an opportunity. Saccharin was cheap, easy to transport, and it didn't spoil. At the beginning of the 20th century, it slowly entered the food supply, mostly in medicines, sometimes in canned foods. At first, most people didn't even know it was there. But not everyone was happy. Sugar producers saw saccharin as a threat. They argued it was unnatural. They questioned its safety. In the early 1900s, this debate reached governments. Some countries tried to restrict it. Others defended its medical use. Artificial sweetness had already become political. Then the world changed. When the First World War began, sugar became scarce. Trade routes were disrupted. Crops were redirected. Rationing became normal. Saccharin filled the gap. It sweetened coffee. It sweetened preserved food. It helped people feel a sense of normal life during chaos. For many, this was their first real exposure to artificial sweeteners, and they got used to the taste. When the war ended, sugar slowly returned. But saccharin stayed. By the 1920s and 30s, it was no longer just a substitute. It was an ingredient. Then came the Second World War. Once again, sugar shortages spread across countries. Once again, artificial sweeteners stepped in. By this point, entire generations had grown up with them. But as usage increased, so did concern. Scientists began asking new questions. What happens when people consume these substances every day? Early studies were limited. Methods were basic. Results were often unclear. Still, doubt began to grow. By the mid-20th century, saccharin was under constant review. Some studies suggested possible risks. Others found no clear evidence. The public received mixed messages. Doctors disagreed. Newspapers simplified complex science. Fear and reassurance existed side by side, yet consumption continued. Because artificial sweeteners solved real problems. They reduced calories. They helped manage blood sugar. They lowered costs. In the 1950s, a new cultural shift began. Dieting entered mainstream culture. Thinness became a symbol of health and success. Artificial sweeteners were suddenly marketed not just as substitutes, but as lifestyle tools. Sweetness without guilt. By the end of the 1960s, saccharin was everywhere. In drinks, in baked goods, in foods people never expected, including bread. But the story was far from settled. Scientific debate intensified. Regulations changed. Public trust wavered. Artificial sweeteners were no longer just a scientific invention. They had become part of daily life. And once something becomes invisible in everyday routines, it becomes very hard to question. Because saccharin was only the beginning, new sweeteners were already being developed. Sweeter, more stable, designed for mass production. What started as an accident was turning into an industry. And in the next chapter of this story, the question would no longer be, can we create sweetness without sugar? It would be, should we? By the time the 1970s arrived, artificial sweeteners were no longer an experiment. They were an industry. Food production was changing fast. Factories became larger. Food traveled farther. And shelves needed products that lasted longer. Sweetness played a key role. It improved flavor, balanced bitterness, and helped processed foods stay consistent. But saccharin had limits. Its taste was sharp, sometimes metallic, and it didn't work well in every product. So scientists kept searching. In laboratories across the United States and Europe, chemists worked on new compounds. Their goal was simple: create something sweet, stable, cheap, and easy to use at scale. In the year 1965, a new discovery quietly entered the picture: aspartame. Like saccharin, it was discovered by accident. A chemist working on ulcer medication touched a compound, then tasted sweetness. Aspartame was different. Its flavor was closer to sugar, smoother, cleaner. Food companies paid attention. After years of testing and review, aspartame began appearing in products during the 1980s, especially in soft drinks. Diet soda changed everything. For the first time, people could drink something sweet, with almost no calories. Sales exploded. Advertising framed it as modern, scientific, smart. Sweetness was no longer just about taste. It was about control. Control over weight, over health, over choices. But with popularity came scrutiny. Scientists debated long-term effects. Some studies suggested possible risks. Others found no strong evidence of harm. The problem was complexity. Nutrition science is rarely simple. Dose matters. Context matters. And individual bodies respond differently. Still, headlines reduced everything to extremes. Safe or dangerous? Good or bad? Meanwhile, more sweeteners entered the market. Acesulfame potassium, often called ACE-K sucralose, each one designed to solve a different problem. Heat stability, shelf life, taste balance. Food labels became longer, harder to read. Artificial sweeteners blended into everyday life, not just in drinks, but in yogurt, cereal, sauces, bread, especially bread, because sweetness improves browning, texture, consistency. Small amounts made a big difference. By the 1990s, many people were consuming artificial sweeteners daily, often without realizing it. Not because they chose diet products, but because sweeteners were built into the system. At the same time, concerns about obesity were rising. Governments looked for solutions. Food companies looked for reformulation. Artificial sweeteners seemed like an answer. Less sugar, fewer calories, same taste. But public trust was fragile. Some people felt misled. Others felt confused. Nutrition advice changed constantly. What was recommended one year was questioned the next. Artificial sweeteners became part of a larger conversation. What does healthy really mean? Is it fewer calories, less sugar, or something else entirely? By the early 2000s, a clear pattern had formed. Artificial sweeteners were not going away. They were too useful, too efficient, too deeply integrated. But their role was no longer unquestioned. Scientists continued researching. Consumers started reading labels, and a new question began to emerge, not just about safety, but about behavior. How does constant sweetness affect the body, the brain, the way we relate to food? That question would shape the next phase of this story, because the future of artificial sweeteners would not be decided only in laboratories. It would be decided in habits, in culture, and in everyday choices.